All right. So Greg Kading, thank you for coming by.
My pleasure, Vlad.
So how long were you working for the LAPD?
I was with the LAPD a little over 22 years. I had 25 years in law enforcement. I had transferred from another agency in Southern California over to LAPD back in the mid-1980s.
Okay. And how did you end up getting involved in the whole 2Pac case?
Well, initially I was assigned to work on the Biggie case because that was an LA-based murder case.
Yeah.
And so I got recruited in to work a task force looking at resurrecting Biggie's murder investigation, which at that time, it was 2006, so his murder was 9 years old. And by way of investigating Biggie's murder, we got involved in investigating 2Pac's murder.
Okay. And once you started investigating 2Pac's murder, what did you find initially?
Well, when we were looking at 2Pac's murder, we were really evaluating two theories. The Suge Knight did it theory or the Southside Crips did it theory. And as we began to kind of go through a process of elimination, we were able to pretty quickly dismiss the Suge Knight aspect, the Suge Knight theory behind 2Pac's murder.
Right.
And that really had us focusing in on the Southside Crips.
Right, because the Suge Knight theory never made any sense to me, because you got a guy that's like 3 times the size of 2Pac. Who in their right mind would try to orchestrate a hit on someone while you're in the car? I guess there was bullets all over the car. Like, this was not like a precision sniper or anything of that sort.
Yeah.
It made no sense completely.
Just on the surface, it's a rather implausible theory.
Yeah. So once you started actually looking into the whole Southside Crip thing, what did you find in your initial investigation?
Well, certainly we had the MGM tape that shows 2Pac Shakur getting into a fight with a Southside Crip named Orlando Anderson. That provided us, at the beginning, at least a motive that these guys might turn around and retaliate. We were able to verify that there were other Southside Crips with Orlando Anderson out in Las Vegas. And then through this process of talking to people and looking at some of the old clues, we saw this very well-established association between the Southside Crips and Bad Boy Records.
Okay. So what other Southside Crips were in Las Vegas at the time that the shooting happened?
There was a group of them. There was about 10 of them out there. The primary ones that we were interested in were the ones that were in the white Cadillac. As you probably are aware, the witnesses in 2Pac's murder all identified that there was this white Cadillac that was the one that drove up alongside Suge and 2Pac and started shooting. So we were primarily interested in the occupants of the Cadillac. We were able to identify them as Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, a guy named DeAndre Smith, another guy named Terrence Brown, and lastly Orlando Anderson, which was the one that 2Pac had been in a fight with earlier.
Okay. And Keefe D was Orlando's uncle?
That is correct. Keefe D was Orlando's uncle.
Okay. So how did you identify these 4 people in the car?
Actually, through the confession of Keefe D himself. He was the one that sat down and provided the information. He identified his nephew as sitting directly behind him. He identified the driver as Terrence Brown, and then the 4th passenger or the 4th occupant, DeAndre Smith, as sitting in the left rear passenger seat.
Okay, so I talked to Robert Ladd and Tim Brennan about some of the stuff that you've talked about, and the one thing that they initially brought up was they had a level of doubt around this whole confession situation, because this was a Las Vegas murder case, but you were LAPD.
Correct. There were some jurisdictional issues initially. It was a Las Vegas murder, clearly. But as we began to unravel some of the events leading up to the murder, we found out that there was a solicitation for murder that took place in Los Angeles, which is obviously within our jurisdiction. So if a crime is occurring in LA, that opens the door for us to investigate it wherever it actually happens.
Okay. So was there any sort of friction or cooperation with Las Vegas PD?
Not really. They were very forthright from the beginning. We were sharing information between the LAPD and Las Vegas PD. They're a little bit, alienated because of their geographical location from the gangs in Compton. And so they relied on intelligence coming from both Compton PD and from Los Angeles PD.
Okay. So you met up with Keefe D. Okay. Where was Keefe D at the time? He was in prison?
No, Keefe D was living down here in Southern California, out in Riverside County. When we initially met up with him, we just went to his house and met him on his own property, informed him of some of the charges that we'd built up against him during a long drug investigation.
Okay.
And
what were the charges?
Distribution of PCP, distribution of large amounts of cocaine, and wiretap investigations, which are these electronic crimes.
Okay. Oh, what kind of wiretap crimes was he doing?
Using a public utility in order to commit a crime.
Okay.
So there's a lot of little technical,
Okay.
white-collar type of crimes.
I see what you're saying. So you guys just basically showed up at Keefe D's house?
That's correct.
Okay. Was it you and another officer?
It was me and my partner, Darren Dupree.
Okay. So you just knocked on his door unannounced?
That's correct. We actually, the garage door was open. He came outside and we encountered him initially right in his driveway.
What was the sort of initial reaction when two cops suddenly show up at your door like that?
I can't speak for him. I mean, Keefe D, comes from a long history of criminal activity and police encounters. So it wasn't his first rodeo. But I'm sure he was quite curious as to why we were there.
Okay. So when you initially started talking to him, how did you sort of present the information to him?
Well, we sat down in his garage and we explained to him that we had been conducting a long-term covert operation, looking at him and others, members of his family even, in a big drug trafficking ring. And once he realized we knew what we were talking about, we were dropping names and talking about events that we witnessed, then he knew that there were some serious problems.
Now, why did you go to his house as opposed to bring him in?
We had, that was our kind of strategic approach, was, we knew that we needed him to talk. And so we wanted to be as cordial initially as we could. We wanted to give him the opportunity to evaluate what we're telling him and then make a decision whether or not he wanted to cooperate. So immediately we advised him, get yourself an attorney and meet us down at the U.S. Attorney's office and let's talk this out.
Okay. So he went and got an attorney.
That day, we met that afternoon in the United States Attorney's office.
Okay, so that's pretty quick.
Immediately.
Okay. So when you met up with him, was he, well, when you initially gave him all that information about all the surveillance he did and everything, was he pretty shooken up or?
You could kind of see the wheels turning in his head. I think, he's a sophisticated, smart guy as far as street crimes go. So, he knew that we weren't bullshitting. And he had his back up against the wall. Okay. So, I think for him, it was just one of these, aha moments.
So he went and met with you at the U.S. Attorney's office. And was there a deal that you offered him at that point?
It's not a deal, it's an agreement. It's known as a proffer agreement. And he's given the opportunity through a agreement between his attorney and the United States attorney to evaluate whether or not it's in his best interest to cooperate. And so that was the arrangement, that he would sit down and tell us everything we wanted to know about anything we asked, and that he had to be entirely truthful, or else he would be charged, not only for the drug crimes, but for potentially his own confession.
Okay. So he sat down with you and started confessing.
That's correct.
How long did he talk for?
Well, we had multiple interviews. It wasn't just one time. We sat down and spoke a variety of times on a variety of different topics. But specifically the 2Pac and Biggie cases were the ones that we were the most interested in. So we spoke for hours over a long period of time.
How did he really lay out that night in terms of what happened from beginning to end? Because from what I understand, you could talk about sort of what led up to the actual altercation at the MGM. So go ahead and just describe the story based on what Keefe D told you.
The group had gone out to Las Vegas without any intent whatsoever to have any problems. They did not go out there with any specific motivation to hunt down Tupac or to have any encounters with Suge Knight. But just by the nature of the rivalry that was taking place between them, they began to have encounters. There was an encounter between the Southside Crips and Suge Knight and his entourage in the arena prior to the event where Orlando Anderson and Tupac Shakur get into a fight.
In Vegas, there was an encounter?
Correct. Prior to the videotape that we see of Tupac and Orlando Anderson getting into an altercation.
Okay, I didn't know about this part. This is the first time hearing about this. So what actually happened before the videotaped altercation?
Well, inside the arena, there was just a brief encounter. Now, these Crips and Bloods from these sets, they know each other. They've encountered each other before during other confrontations. And so they recognize each other. And there's a little bit of a push and shove match. Nothing serious, but a statement is made from Suge Knight that he's untouchable. And the Crip replies, well, you can be touched. And this was set a little bit of a adversarial type of setting or environment right off the bat as soon as they saw each other.
Okay. So then what happened after the fight?
After the fight, Tupac Shakur and several members of the Mob Piru, Suge's entourage, and members of Death Row, they're all kind of milling around. I don't know if you've been to the MGM, but after a fight, it's just, it's pandemonium. There's just people everywhere. And because there was already this encounter, Trayvon Lane, who had a prior confrontation with Orlando Anderson, recognized Orlando from a prior fight between the two of them, and tells Tupac, hey, be on guard, there's one of our enemies. Tupac takes it upon himself to go over and initiate a altercation with Orlando. The rest of the Mob Piru run over and jump in as kind of a gangbang, and that's what happened at the MGM.
Okay. What happened after that altercation with Orlando?
After the altercation, Orlando kind of licked his wounds and went and found his uncle, Keefe D, who was nearby. Keefe D was with some other Southside Crips and along with some characters from New York, some associates from New York, including a guy named Eric Zip Martin, who was a drug associate of Keefe D's. And they just had a conversation about the fact that Orlando was just attacked by not only Tupac, but from the Death Row entourage, and they plan retaliation. And Zip and his crew offer to assist Keefe D and his crew, and Keefe D says, no, we got this, we can handle it. However, they didn't take any guns out there. They weren't stupid enough to travel across the Nevada and California desert with guns and to Las Vegas. And so Zip, who did have a gun, offered his, and they went out to the parking lot, and he went into his car, got a hold of the Glock 40 caliber gun and handed it to Keefe D, and off they went in search of Tupac and Suge.
So it was just one gun?
Just one gun.
Okay. So how did they end up actually running into Suge and Tupac's car?
The Southside Crips knew, everybody in Vegas knew that, had any interest, that Tupac Shakur and Mike Tyson and other celebrities were going to be over at Suge Knight's 662 Club. So the Crips went there initially, kind of lied in wait, and once there was an awareness by the Mob Pirus that the Crips were in the vicinity, the Crips thought it best just to kind of pack up their bags and move out. So as they were leaving, they're going down the street, they go to a liquor store, and shortly after departing from that liquor store, they happened to see Tupac and Suge and this entourage of vehicles, or this caravan of vehicles, going down the street in the opposite direction.
Okay, so was there any video footage from the liquor store, or was there, was the liquor store owner ever confirmed that they saw them, or no?
Keep in mind, we don't gain this information until we get Keefe D's confession in 2009. So it's way after the fact that we even become aware that they had gone to a liquor store.
Okay. So they turn around, they drive the opposite direction, and then what happens?
They're looking into the different vehicles. Orlando Anderson gets the gun from Keefe D, who is in the front seat. He hands it to the back seat. Orlando takes it. And as they pull up along the passenger side of Suge's BMW, Orlando leans out the window and begins firing in the direction of both 2Pac and Suge.
Okay. And then what happens next?
What happens next is, this all happens in almost in a matter of just seconds. The white Cadillac begins to peel away, and it makes a right turn at the intersection. There's some females that are in a convertible Sebring who duck down because they hear the gunfire just over their shoulders and behind them. They also try to make a right turn at that intersection. They almost have a collision with the white Cadillac. And then another vehicle that was in the entourage was Suge Knight, driven by a guy named Alton McDonald, Buntry. He takes off initially with his passenger Neckbone to chase the white Cadillac, and there's some exchange of gunfire between the white Cadillac and the entourage vehicle. Meanwhile, Suge Knight is trying to, react to this whole thing, get out of that immediate kill zone, and he does a U-turn in order to go the other direction.
Okay, so how many shots were fired at Suge's car?
According to the reports, there's two. There's two claims. It was either 7 or 9. So depending on whether you want to count shell casings or whether you want to count the number of times the vehicle's hit, there's a variable there.
So the vehicle was hit 7 times?
Correct.
So they basically just unloaded the clip, more or less?
No, a 9mm Glock carries more rounds than that.
Okay. How many rounds in a 9mm?
It depends on whether it was a subcompact or whether full size, but upwards of like 13 rounds.
Okay, so half a clip, more or less.
Correct.
Okay. And the shots are all over the car?
Yeah, they are. They go from the back, to the door, right outside of where 2Pac's seated, and then also some from the kind of a front direction, like through a windshield.
Okay. 2Pac was hit how many times?
2Pac was hit 4 times, I believe.
And Suge was hit?
Suge took a wound to the back of his head, and supposedly there's a metal fragment still inside of the base of his skull. It's undetermined whether or not that's a bullet fragment or whether it's a fragment of metal that came from, the shrapnel of metal in the car.
Okay. So the white Cadillac takes off. Suge makes a U-turn and tries to get the car out of the area. So someone from the death row entourage started to chase the white Cadillac and shoot at it?
Very briefly.
Very briefly. How many shots were fired, do you know?
Well, we know that the vehicle that was giving chase, the Toyota Supra that was driven by Alton McDonald, it suffered at least one gunshot wound to that vehicle. There was a bullet that went into the door of that car. So we know that Orlando shot at least once behind him and hit Buntry's car. How many shots that Neckbone may have shot downrange, we just don't know. We don't have that information.
So Orlando's car shot back and hit the car from Suge's entourage.
That's correct.
Did anyone get hurt or actually get hit, or just the car?
Just the car.
Just the car.
And then another parked vehicle was also struck.
Okay, so it was multiple shots there, basically. So it was just a full-blown shootout at that point.
Right.
Okay. How far did Suge get before his car stopped?
Approximately 1 mile. From the initial crime scene to the secondary crime scene, it's about a mile.
Okay, and what happened after the mile?
His car came to rest. Obviously, there's a law enforcement response to all of this. They get there. They begin to, immediately evaluate the situation. Suge's car is damaged, almost to the point where it's disabled, and the cops begin to try to figure out what had just taken place. They are trying to, get the things under control. They don't know if Suge Knight and the rest of the guys in this group are the suspects, are they victims, are they armed, are they not? So, initially there was some apprehension on behalf of Las Vegas PD, not knowing exactly what they were dealing with. Ultimately, they summoned an ambulance who came and took Suge and 2Pac to the hospital.
Okay. Now, what happened when Las Vegas PD started to question the people in the vicinity?
It was a typical gang type of investigation where you just don't get a lot of cooperation. There was, the initial crime scene, remember, is now a mile down the road off of Koval and Flamingo, and most of the witnesses have gone away. People aren't just sitting around waiting to see if the police are going to come, because it's not like they were directly involved. So police began to question people, and you just didn't get a lot of cooperation. Yafu Fula and members of the Outlaws, who were in the vehicle behind Suge, along with 2Pac's bodyguard Frank Alexander, they give brief descriptions. White car, multiple occupants, white Cadillac, and a guy with a gun, hanging out the window. But that's about the extent of it. No license plate, no positive IDs, and so that was the type of information Las Vegas was dealing with.
Now, what did Suge say?
Suge didn't initially cooperate. It took quite an effort to get him to come into the station. He was at the hospital that night. He did not cooperate at the hospital when the cops went over there to interview him. Ultimately, after repeated requests to come to the station, he showed up with his attorney, but he was very evasive, didn't provide any valuable information, and just basically says didn't know what happened.
Okay. Las Vegas, one of the most videotaped places in the world, in terms of surveillance and so forth, because so many people, there's so much money, there's so many people trying to cheat the casinos, there's, why was there no videotape? There's videotape of the MGM altercation, but there was no videotape of anything that happened after that.
Keep in mind, this is 1996. We look at it from a 2015 perspective. Yeah. This is 1996. The videotape surveillance is not as prevalent, especially out on streets. It's just, it's not surprising at all that there isn't more video footage. We're lucky that we have what we have. And even with that, the MGM, with the best surveillance, for that day, the best surveillance equipment available, and you see how grainy and, the low quality of what we do have. Yeah. So that, that puts into perspective the times.
And it's even, at one point, it's even obstructed in terms of the MGM video. They go behind like a pillar or something, and there's no other camera, I guess. And so
there's a big fountain there.
Yeah.
And so, there's a camera technician or an operator sitting in an office somewhere, and he's looking at all these monitors, and he sees something taking place, and he's kind of joysticking in order to move the camera around.
Oh, so someone's actually sitting there moving. This wasn't just a sweeping camera. Someone's actually sitting there trying to find
that particular one. Then there's also, kind of still cameras that are throughout the rest of the MGM. And so when you look online and you watch the full MGM video, that's a compilation of a lot of different cameras all patched together.
Gotcha. So, from your point of view, do you feel that Las Vegas PD dropped the ball, or do you feel that they just had such limited resources because of the non-cooperation that they did the best they could?
I think that Las Vegas wanted, like any other murder, homicide investigators want to solve the case. But when you're dealing with people that are either uncooperative or outright lying to you about the information that they have, it makes it very difficult. And you can develop an attitude of, well, shit, if they don't give a shit about us solving the case, why should we? I'm not saying that that was the perspective, but it certainly is a perspective in law enforcement among certain investigators, is that if the people who are closest to our victim aren't willing to cooperate, how far can we go with our investigation? What can we actually accomplish? You know, we weren't there, we didn't see it, and if the people who were there and did see it aren't really providing any valuable information, it's difficult to move forward.
But this is an incident with international ramifications. Like this, Tupac in 2015, most hip hop fans still consider him the best rapper of all time. This wasn't just a random gang member who got killed in Vegas, and you know, it was just a random, like it was just like a run-of-the-mill kind of situation, because this is what happens. This is Tupac, the movie star, the platinum-selling artist, the you know, the guy who's dating Madonna. Like, you know what I'm saying? It's like it's at a very huge level at this point. So yeah, the people around are not cooperating, but there's international pressure that's making Las Vegas PD look bad for not being able to solve this.
Well, you always look bad if you don't solve something, and it is your responsibility to solve something. So that's unavoidable. You know, people are going to question your competence, or question your motives, or you know, your interest in solving it. But it's a you know, perfect storm of events that actually prevented it from being solved. So yeah, I get that that there's a lot of pressure and a lot of interest, but you have to deal with the information that's available. And if you don't have information to work with, what are you going to do?
So Keefe D comes in. He testifies for hours with you guys. Based on what he's saying, is it all matching up?
Yeah, it does. We didn't just take his word for anything. You know, we know that you know, he's a career criminal. He's a gang member, and that you know, he's going to have to be corroborated on every level in order to verify whether or not he's telling the truth. And everything he told us checked out from start to finish. And when you have that type of corroboration, and you're providing that information under these very compelling circumstances that he was, you know, empirically, you start to recognize that it's true.
So after all of that, all of the confessions that he gave you guys, what did that result in for him?
It resulted in him getting away with murder. It resulted in him getting away with a very serious federal drug offense. So, you know, he walked away from this thing basically unscathed.
So you guys actually dropped your charges against him?
We have never actually charged him. We just informed him of the potential charges that we had built, but we never charged him.
Okay, so based on what he came in and said, the U.S. District Attorney agreed not to go forward with the charges against Keefe D.
That's correct. And remember, the entire objective of this task force was to solve murders. And if we have to, you know, it's all, you know, it's all a matter of trying to reach that objective and that goal. And solving the murders was more important than, you know, pursuing drug crimes.
So had he not cooperated with you guys on the drug charges, because ultimately no one was being charged with the murder of Tupac.
That's correct.
But he was about to get charged with this PCP and drug ring and cocaine ring. Had you guys gone forward with those charges and he got convicted in a court for those charges, how long would he have gotten in prison?
Life.
Life. So he was fighting a life sentence essentially.
That's correct.
Why
he
life?
Would have gotten 25 because there's a minimum mandatory sentencing, and because of his prior drug convictions and the amount of drugs that we would have charged him with and the crimes that we would have charged him with, he would have gotten 25 to life. And you know, that's when you're in your late 40s, you know, that's essentially a life sentence.
So he got away with all the drug charges essentially. So he was never charged.
That's correct.
So he comes in, He confesses to all this stuff. He implicates himself, but of course, by him testifying, that excludes excludes the confession from being used against him. Right?
That's correct. It's almost like a limited immunity. Now, if other people came forward and we were able to gather evidence against Keefe D through other sources, he could certainly be charged. Under this agreement, he just couldn't be charged based on his own self-incriminating statements. So that's where the protection lied. He'd cooperate and we would take what he had to tell us and it wouldn't be used against him. However, we could take what he had to tell us and use it against anybody else he implicated, but just not himself.
Well, by the time he testified, Orlando Anderson was already killed.
That's right.
In an unrelated kind of situation. I
That's
understand
right.
There was a shootout that happened over some money that was owed or whatever, and Orlando Anderson was killed. But Keefe D is actually testifying against other people in the car as well.
Testifying, but providing information.
Providing information, yeah. He was providing information about other people that were in the vehicle. Now, if you're in the vehicle, it doesn't matter. You can't say, yeah, I was there when they killed 2Pac, but I looked the other way and I wasn't part of it. If you're in the car, you are now part of the crime. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. I mean, you can claim that, hey, I was just driving and, we went over to, to confront these guys, and out of nowhere, Orlando, pulls out a gun and starts shooting. I didn't know he was going to do that. I mean, that could be a defense claim. It's not very reasonable, but certainly you could claim that. But based on all the set of circumstances and all the information that we know, they were all willingly and agreeingly, collaborating or conspiring to kill 2Pac.
By the time the Keefe D gave you that information, Orlando was gone. What about the other two members in the car?
Dre was already gone. He was in the passenger seat behind the driver.
How did he die?
He died from natural causes, obesity and health-related causes.
Okay.
And Terrence Anderson, the driver, he just recently died. He was shot and killed inside of a marijuana dispensary in Compton. And so now...
When was this?
Just recently, within the last couple months.
Oh.
So Keefe D's last man standing.
But at the time that he testified, the driver was still alive.
That's correct.
Okay, so he goes and he goes and gives information about the driver. Did you guys go and follow up with the driver?
Unfortunately not. That's where law enforcement completely dropped the ball. We provided the information back to Las Vegas about Keefe D's confession, implicating Terrence Brown, the driver. Terrence Brown at this time is, still criminally active in Compton, and there was no proactive effort to put him into the same position that we'd put Keefe into, and that's develop charges against him and bring him in, and you can use the confessions against one another. But there was no proactive investigation after we had acquired Keefe D's confession to pursue Terrence Brown.
Could you have pursued Terrence Brown, or Las Vegas had to pursue it?
We could have in Los Angeles. I would have just went and developed an independent drug investigation against him. I'd have started surveillance, doing basically the same thing I did against Keefe, and put him into a very compromising position, and develop intelligence and evidence, and put him into the same position. But I was taken off the case shortly after we had acquired this information. The LAPD disbanded the task force after we'd solved Biggie's case, and the whole thing just kind of dissipated.
Why?
I think that for the LAPD, they had, we had gotten to this point where they could get out from under this massive lawsuit being waged against them by Biggie's estate. And at this point in time, so much money and resources and manpower had been spent trying to investigate this case and to defend the city. They just walked away from it all after they got out from under the lawsuit.
What happened with the Biggie lawsuit?
The Biggie lawsuit was dismissed, basically retracted by the estate itself once we developed the evidence pointing away from the LAPD and the LAPD's culpability. the estate of Biggie Smalls decided they weren't going to spend any more time or money to pursue a lawsuit that they knew they couldn't win.
So because LAPD managed to get the Biggie wrongful death lawsuit dismissed, were they worried that if you kept digging into the 2Pac thing, that it would, that lawsuit might reemerge?
No, not at all. There was no crossover as far as involvement or allegations of involvement of LAPD in 2Pac's murder.
Okay.
So that they weren't connected in that way. So there was no fear of that whatsoever. The LAPD just decided to kind of let sleeping dogs lie and walk away from it all after they've gotten out from under the lawsuit. They disbanded the task force.
Okay.
And we told Las Vegas PD what we had discovered and left it up to them to pursue it.
And they didn't pursue it?
Clearly not.
Were you upset?
Absolutely.
Do you think there was some sort of conspiracy?
No, not at all. I think it's just an attitude of indifference. So much time had passed, so many witnesses had died, and it was ultimately going to be a very, very difficult case to try to prosecute in court, especially after what we had, the information that we had acquired in the investigation. And for practical purposes, I can kind of understand the bureaucratic decision to let everything just go. But from a personal standpoint, from an investigative standpoint, it was very disheartening. I mean, both of those cases deserve to be pursued further.
Okay. So, Keefe D provides the information to you guys. He walks away from these drug charges and these murder charges, essentially.
The murder charge.
The murder charge, right. What happens with Keefe D after that?
He goes about his business. He becomes kind of persona non grata to a certain degree.
What does that mean?
He's got, once people in his neighborhood find out that he's cooperated, he's, loses some of his, the tarnish on his reputation. He begins to even have some conflict internally with members of his gang who know that he's, given up his nephew and given up other Southside Crips like Terrence Brown and DeAndre. And so he's, has to deal with that. But Keefe D's, he's a street gangster and he deals with things, in a street manner. So he continued to just, go about his business and his life like he always had until he got caught with a gun and some dope, and he was charged. And then he was at large for a while until he was picked up on those charges and then went to prison. And I think he got 14 months, but he's recently been released.
Okay. Well, was Keefe D still living in Compton at the time? Or, well, I guess he was living in Riverside when you guys approached him, so he wasn't really in Compton anymore.
Correct. He was living his family and, his home away from home, so to speak, was out in Riverside. But he has family back in Compton. His neighborhood's back in Compton, in the Southside Crip neighborhood. And so, he gravitates towards there naturally because that's where he grew up, that's where his friends are, and that's where he conducts his business.
Okay. But there is a tension now with Southside and his family in terms of what he
There's issues. I'm sure the family doesn't appreciate what he did, but ultimately they have to understand that what he did was protecting them also. We had other members of his family that had been wrapped up in this drug ring. And so by cooperating with us, he protected them from being charged also. So it's a double-edged sword for him. They probably look at him with a skeptical eye because he threw his nephew under the bus. But at the same time, he protected them from going to prison.
Okay. And Keefe D now is out of prison.
That's right.
As far as you know.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone else in the car is dead.
That's correct.
By the time you picked up the case, was Orlando still alive?
No, by the time I picked up the case in 2006, Orlando had already been dead nearly 8 years.
Okay, so you weren't involved in any of the stuff after it happened?
Well, I wasn't involved in real time, but an investigation goes backwards just as often as it goes forward.
Yeah.
So we have to go back and evaluate everything that we know happened in history in order to catch up with the times and move forward.
Now, Orlando ended up testifying on Suge's behalf during Suge's trial?
That's right. He perjured himself in order to assist Suge Knight get out from under his probation violation.
Okay. And why do you think Orlando Anderson testified on Suge's behalf after Suge is on video jumping him?
He did it for one simple reason. He was getting paid to do it.
Okay. Do you know how much he got paid to do it?
It was either $16,000 or $60,000, depending on what source you talk to.
Okay. But in the tens of thousands of dollars.
Correct.
After Orlando testified on Suge's behalf, what became of the relationship between the Southside Crips and the Mob Piru?
Things didn't change between the crews. I mean, their rivalries, regardless of their associations with, Suge Knight or Bad Boy, they're Bloods and Crips. And so just by the very nature of that opposition, they're going to be at odds. But once all of the conflicts started between Death Row and Bad Boy, it really kind of exacerbated that situation. And, it was a shoot on sight type of environment for both of those crews.
Okay. And I'm gonna pretty much leave alone the whole Bad Boy part of things. I'll let you guys deal with that.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, like I know Puffy. I'm cool with some of his people, and for me to start digging up this part of the story,
I understand.
Is
See, you're just like the LAPD. There's places you don't want to go.
No, I mean it's not even that. But it's not my job. I mean it's like
I'm just messing with you, man.
I know what you're saying. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I really kind of want to discuss in this. But what's your take on Suge's current situation?
I think Suge has a pretty good defense in his current criminal matter. I think he has a good self-defense situation. But, this is just more of Suge being Suge, pressing up on people, creating conflicts. He has this kind of false sense of reality that, he's not the king of the streets anymore. And he expects people to pay dues and dividends to him for favors done in the past. And, it's just by the nature of, how Suge Knight conducts business, trouble's always going to follow him.
But from your professional standpoint, you think that he might actually get off?
I think he has a really good chance of getting off on a self-defense. And, clearly you see the video that works in his favor to a certain degree. Some of the statements of the witnesses, including Claybone, that works in his defense. So he has a good chance. Remember, you've got to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right. Why do you think the bail was set at such an astronomical number? What was it, like 25 million to begin with, which was like, this is like Unabomber numbers.
The prosecution was able to establish that Suge Knight was a threat to the community, and that because of his history and what we know about Suge Knight, there was a high probability that he would reach out and either try to dissuade or coerce witnesses or harm witnesses. And so there was a community issue, a community safety issue. And then there was also concerned about a flight risk. So that's one of the reasons that they were able to successfully argue for such a high bail amount.
Okay. And he's still in jail right now?
He's still incarcerated.
Right. And his trial's coming up. I know that when I talked to the Compton PD guys, to Tim Brennan in particular, he couldn't really comment too much on it because he felt that he might actually be pulled into this trial based on his previous dealings with Suge and you know, some of the stuff that happened. Are you going to be pulled into this trial at all, you think? Or?
I don't know. I don't know what to expect with this. We did develop a lot of information that works against Suge during our task force investigation. At the same time that we were conducting our murder investigations of Biggie and 2Pac, we were also conducting a federal racketeering investigation of Suge Knight in the defunct death row records. So we developed a lot of information that I can see the prosecutor wanting to use to discredit Suge Knight and to kind of help develop for the jury the kind of character he is.
Sometimes in the criminal system, you have situations like, for example, the OJ. OJ was sentenced to 33 years in prison for showing up, trying to get his stuff back from someone who he felt had stolen his stuff. I've heard of murderers getting less than 33 years. Number one, do you feel that OJ, you know, based on your professional opinion, do you feel that 33 years was a reasonable amount of time based on OJ's crime?
Probably not a reasonable amount of time based on that particular crime, but it certainly would be a reasonable amount of time based on the evidence that he committed murder. I know that the two can't be necessarily overlapped, but you know, sometimes it's karma. And I think that potentially people in a position to pass judgment, such as the judge in that case, may have been motivated to set justice straight, you know, in giving him so much time.
I mean, but that is illegal, isn't it?
For a judge, there's not a lot of things illegal for judges.
Okay.
They kind of write the law. So.
Well, no, I mean, not necessarily. I mean,
you're not supposed to take past crimes into consideration or allegations of past crimes into consideration. Yeah. So you can take prior convictions into consideration when you're sentencing, but you know, things happen in court all the time that can be, you know, viewed as inappropriate.
Do you think that in the Suge situation, you could potentially see the same type of thing, where he might be found guilty of maybe a lesser crime, but they give him an inflated sentence based on things that they felt he may have done in the past?
Well, they're apples and oranges, Suge Knight and O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson was not a convicted criminal. O.J. Simpson doesn't have multiple felony convictions in his history. So those, like I was saying, those do come into consideration when you're passing sentence. So because Suge has a pretty extensive criminal history, that'll play against him if he gets convicted.
Okay. Now, when you look at how, let's say, the hip hop community views the whole, you know, 2Pac investigation and so forth, a lot of the community is very distrustful of LAPD. Mm-hmm. They feel that there is corruption in the police department. You know, I interviewed BG Knockout, and he actually accused Blondie of being crooked and, you know, placing drugs on people, you know, in order to, you know, people he didn't like, and then so forth. Which, you know, I brought that up to Blondie's attention. He denied it. I've talked to LAPD guys in the past, and they've acknowledged that they've heard of situations of police corruption and that type of thing. You personally, being in LAPD for as many years as you've been in, have you seen corruption with some of your coworkers?
Listen, in any large organization, be it NYPD or LAPD or Atlanta PD or Chicago PD, you're going to have a certain element of people that shouldn't be there, and they're going to conduct themselves in ways that reflects upon the agency as a whole. Of course, LAPD has had corrupt cops historically. You know, we've had bank robbers, we've had murderers, we've had drug thieves and drug dealers. So, we have an element which is to be expected in a large organization. But the LAPD also does a really good job of policing itself. Who discovers the corruption? We do. Who prosecutes the corruption and investigates the corruption?
Well,
we do.
Sometimes the media.
Well, sometimes the media, but ultimately the evidence doesn't get gathered from them. Think about David Mack. Who investigated David Mack and put him away for prison? The LAPD. Rafael Perez. Who investigated him and put him in prison? The LAPD. So we do a pretty good job of policing ourselves. We want it to be a clean organization. At least 95, 98% of us want it to be perceived as a legitimate, law-abiding organization. But, it just takes a few bad apples to spoil the whole apple cart.
Now, David Mack, was he Compton PD?
David Mack was LAPD.
Was LAPD. Describe why David Mack went to prison.
David Mack robbed a bank. He robbed a Bank of America in association with several of his friends, and went to prison for it.
Why would an LAPD officer rob a bank? Of all the crimes that an LAPD guy can commit, because you're dealing with other criminals. You're dealing with drugs that nobody wants to be reported. You're dealing with cash that nobody wants to be reported. Like, cops robbing drug dealers has been something that's been happening from the very beginning. Why would you go and rob a bank?
First of all, David Mack was at that time that he robbed a bank, he's a uniformed cop. He didn't have access to drug dealers, and to that extent. Street drug dealers, you might get a few $100 here, maybe a couple $1,000, but you're not going to be able to get $722,000 from one criminal act, which is what he got in the Bank of America heist. So obviously he's going for big money, and and he thought he was smart enough to get away with it. He wasn't, obviously, but it's just greed.
How was David Mack connected to Death Row Records?
He's not.
He wasn't?
Not at all.
Okay. But there were police officers that were connected to Death Row Records?
Correct.
And who were they?
There was a variety of them that were moonlighting, doing security for Reggie Wright Jr., who ran Death Row Records security, Right Way Security. And so he would hire friends to come, and they would moonlight as security.
Which is completely legal.
It's legal to an extent. A law was passed that you're not supposed to provide, that cops or armed bodyguards aren't supposed to provide protective services for convicted criminals. So there was a compromising issue there. So yeah, cops were doing it. They were moonlighting it. Again, this is back in the mid-1990s. And they came from different agencies: Compton PD, Compton School Police, Inglewood PD, San Bernardino. So there was a variety of guys that were associated with Reggie Wright, who he would rely on to come in and provide protective services, and he liked to use off-duty cops.
And Reggie Wright, was he the one that was connected to Compton PD?
He was retired from Compton PD.
Was he the chief?
No, Reggie Wright Jr. was just a Compton police officer. His father was on the job, who was a lieutenant with Compton PD. And after he got a medical retirement, he started to do bodyguard work for Death Row Records.
I know that there was a certain level of suspicion because you now have Compton PD being employed by Death Row Records, pretty much, right?
Well, again, it was a variety of different agencies who had officers moonlighting as security for Death Row. It wasn't just Compton PD. There were several.
But the guy that's running the company
is retired from Compton.
Is retired, but do you see what I'm saying here? There's still that connection.
Well, a lot of cops retire and open up security agencies. Yeah, he went on and became exclusive to Death Row Records because that's where the opportunity was for him to get himself work. And so because he had a history in Compton, and I think that that just opened the door. I don't find it necessarily suspicious or unusual.
Gotcha. What's your take in terms of what's been happening recently with the police and Ferguson and video cameras and so forth? It seems like a lot of police abuses have been brought to light, which previously have not been brought to light because everyone didn't have a video camera on them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, number one, do you feel that these types of police abuses are more prevalent now, or is it just that more people have cameras?
I believe it's more people have cameras. And I'm not going to necessarily agree that it's police abuse. Oftentimes we see what appears to be abuse, and then when more investigation is conducted, we find out that it's not necessarily as egregious as we think. So we have to look at every individual situation and look at it wholly, not just from a 5-second video, and determine whether it's police abuse or how appropriate the use of force was. Because we have a tendency in society with social media to see something, believe that's all there is to it, and then judge based on that.
Right.
But as we've seen over and over and over again, there's these alleged or perceived abuses that have very reasonable explanations.
I mean, for example, there was a small part of the Rodney King tape that was presented to the media, what the media ran with. But there was a longer part of the tape that I've seen as well that showed Rodney King running at the police and so forth. And so there is multiple sides of it.
Correct.
The FBI director, the current FBI director, feels that there is a spike in crime because of there's more police misconduct videos out there.
Yeah, again, I think that people respond oftentimes to limited information. And that can cause a spike in crime, a spike in police confrontations. Again, each situation has to be evaluated individually, and you can't rush to judgment. You got to figure out what preceded the video and what took place, from multiple different perspectives in order to really evaluate a situation. But our society wants to immediately judge based on socioeconomic perspectives, prior encounters with law enforcement. So there's it's a complicated issue.
Do you agree with body cameras for police?
I do. I think body cameras are one of the best things that cops can have. They oftentimes exonerate police officers. We just saw a recent event where there was a teacher alleging that she was racially profiled in a neighborhood, and she made a big thing about it, and it kind of went viral. But then when we see the actual dash cam video, we see that the cops were acting absolutely professional, and that there was no indication that there was any kind of racial component to it. So, the cameras are your friend.
No, I remember there was, I think, Taraji P. Henson's son claimed that he was racially profiled, and his mom went on a big tirade about it. And then I believe LAPD released the tape, and Taraji actually went back and apologized and said, actually, this was my son's fault. The police were very, very polite and so forth. The story she got from her son was very different than what actually was viewed on tape. I think that's pretty much it. Anything else you want to add that we didn't really cover about the whole 2Pac thing?
We have a documentary coming out on November 14th on Reel's channel.
So tell me about this documentary.
The name of the documentary is Murder Rap, Inside the Biggie and Tupac Murder Investigations. It's based on the 2011 book that I published, Murder Rap. And it's like the book on steroids. It has all kinds of audio interviews and documents that we couldn't put in the book. And it basically tells the entire story of what took place in these murders.
Okay. Now, there has been multiple books about these murders. And it seems like there's been a number of I believe LAPD investigators that after they retired, they went and released books. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yeah, and there really hasn't been a number of books in regard is you've got, you know, John Potash's book about the FBI being behind 2Pac's killing.
Okay.
And then you have Labyrinth, which is a book that was written by Randall Sullivan, where he collaborated with Russell Poole, another ex-LAPD guy, and they proposed a theory that LA cops were involved in Biggie's murder. But that theory was wholly refuted. And unlike that book, we just used evidence from the case in order to write Murder Rap and tell the story from a very transparent perspective. And, you know, we let the investigation take us where the evidence took us. We didn't have a motive to try to prove something based on preconceived notions.
So tell me about the book that actually alleges that the FBI orchestrated 2Pac's death.
There's a book out there that promotes the idea that the government, the FBI, were instrumental in 2Pac's death because he was this aspiring rapper with political aspirations, and they wanted to silence him before he could get a movement going.
Well, he was not aspiring. He was a very established rapper. He was already a multi-platinum. He was probably the biggest rapper in the world at that point.
Yeah.
And he did come from a Black Panther background.
Correct.
And he was definitely riling people up in terms of what he felt was unjust treatment of African Americans in America.
Correct. And so I'm not refuting all of that. I'm just simply saying that to then make the leap to murder is really, it's a big chasm. There's no evidence to support it, and that's the problem. Sure, you can create a motive. You can say, well, here's why they would do it. But motive is meaningless unless you have evidence connecting the motive to the crime. And that's the difference here, is there's nothing to support such a theory.
So in terms of your documentary, what is different about your documentary rather than the other theories and the other books that have come out previously?
The difference in our documentary is it's all fact-based. It's evidence-based information. It comes from inside the investigation, not from outside. So we had all of the material to rely on, access to everything. And so that's the difference. It wasn't based on speculation and innuendo. It was based on facts and evidence.
So you guys create this documentary about the murders of Biggie and 2Pac. And you say that it's all fact-based, it's all internal, it solves all these questions that everyone has. But here we are in 2016, and no one's been convicted for these crimes. And they're still unsolved by LAPD and Las Vegas PD.
Yeah, you're right. It doesn't sit right that we could have this kind of information and evidence and nobody goes to jail. But we have to keep in mind that when we've obtained this information, it's 13 years after the murder of Tupac Shakur and 12 years after the murder of Biggie.
Right, but to be fair, there is no statute of limitations for murder.
Correct. There's no statute of limitations for murder. However, you still have to have, people to charge. Orlando Anderson's dead. DeAndre's dead. Keefe D's own confession is protected against self-incrimination. Many of the witnesses have passed on. So, when you look at it in the totality of circumstances, it's a very, very difficult case to try to charge either of them because we didn't develop the critical information till long after the fact. However, we can tell you definitively that this is what took place on March 9th of 1997 and September 9th of 1996. We know what took place, and it's been established through empirical evidence.
But people still get convicted of murders even after they've died. Is that correct?
That's correct. People can be convicted of murder. Wait a minute, you mean like Orlando Anderson?
Yeah. Is that,
no.
So that's not possible?
You can't charge a dead person.
You can't?
No.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, clearly they can't defend themselves, but
you can't charge a dead person.
You just can't charge. So once the person is dead, then the investigation is gone.
In regard to that person.
To that person. Okay. Right. I know. I remember watching 60 Minutes where in Russia, like a dead person got charged, and so forth. It's slightly different. Okay, so the only person that could really be charged at this point in the 2Pac murder is Keefe D.
Of the conspirators that were in the car that night, Keefe D is the sole survivor.
Right. So at this point, there's really no one that could even testify against him.
Correct.
Unless someone claims that he told them, and then they turn around. But then that becomes
hearsay.
That becomes hearsay.
Yeah.
There's no actual, or if someone actually at the crime scene comes forward and
like Suge Knight himself.
Right.
Suge Knight knew exactly who was in that Cadillac. Keefe D and Suge Knight were childhood friends. They'd known each other for years. Suge Knight looked across the car directly into Keefe D's eyes. He knew exactly who had shot at him and 2Pac that night, which is exactly why the mini war started in Compton the next day. But there was never any question in Suge Knight's mind who that was, and all he had to do was simply sit down with Las Vegas investigators and say, I recognized Keefe D in the front seat of that car, and that would have led to them being able to develop a prosecutable case against everybody there.
Why do you think Suge Knight didn't do that?
It's not in his nature to cooperate with law enforcement. He would rather handle things on the street and maintain his reputation as opposed to cooperating with the cops and being labeled a snitch. And it's not the code that he lives by.
What happened after the 2Pac shooting in Compton?
Immediately after 2Pac was shot, members of the mob Piru and their affiliate blood gangs got together and decided that they'd retaliate against the Southside Crips for what had happened. Okay,
and what happened at that point?
There was some sporadic shootings taking place between the neighborhoods. It was one of these like on-site type of atmospheres where if you see members of the rival crew, you're trying to gun them down. But it's a lot more difficult than people think. You have to go into your rival's neighborhood to find them, which means you're exposing yourself to the same kind of danger that you're there to do.
What did you, in terms of your investigation, what did you know about Orlando Anderson in terms of his reputation, his criminal record, and his alleged criminal activities?
Orlando Anderson was known as a shooter. So was Terrence Brown. They were involved in prior criminal activities, violent criminal activities. Orlando had a bank robbery. Terrence Brown had been in a encounter where he was shot 10 times, all of this prior to Las Vegas. So these guys were active criminal gang members. And this was all just part of, living out that mold.
Was Orlando actually being investigated for murders or shootings or anything else like that?
Yeah, at the time of the 2Pac Shakur murder, Orlando Anderson was already under investigation by Compton PD for another murder. I think the victim's name in that was Albert Webb or something to that effect.
Okay. Did you know about Sanika Shakur, Monster?
I know who Monster is, yes.
Okay. There was I believe a Vibe interview where Monster said that he was in the same prison as Suge, and he said that Suge told him that Orlando was the shooter. Did you investigate this at all?
Yeah, I've heard that claim. Obviously, that corroborates Keefe D, and it corroborates the idea that Suge knew exactly who it was. So I'm not surprised to hear that. But again, unless Shakur is willing to step forward and take the witness stand, which we both know he wouldn't do, that becomes unusable information.
So, from your point of view, you talk about Monster, Sanika Shakur. let's just say monster, because you'll start saying, you'll say Shakur and people will
I know.
assume it's Tupac Shakur.
Yeah.
So from a gang point of view, why would a gang member do an interview with Vibe magazine and essentially state a bunch of inside criminal information, but yet but feel that that's any different than working with the police and saying the exact same thing? Because can't that actually be used as evidence, an interview?
It can be used as impeachment evidence if he were ever to put up on a stand and questioned, and he gave another answer than what he'd previously said publicly. Then they could, impeach him with that or use that to establish his credibility, either or. So it just depends. A lot of people speak to news outlets and magazines, and they'll tell the story that they have to tell, but that doesn't mean they're willing to sit down and provide that same information to the cops and then be willing to take the stand. Perfect examples are individuals like Frank Alexander and Kevin Hackey, who promote books and DVDs about what they think happened, but then when they're required to go to depositions and required to testify in court, all of a sudden they get amnesia, or they become afraid of the repercussions of testifying in court.
So you can actually use an interview as part of a conviction?
No, you can't. Convictions have to be based on courtroom testimony, courtroom evidence.
Okay.
But you can use it, as I said, in order to impeach a witness if they get up on the stand and say something other than what they've said publicly.
Well, when you say impeachment, does that mean perjury? Or is that different?
Well, it can be perjury if you're proving what they're saying on the stand is the lie. Now, if the lie was the newspaper article and what they're saying on the stand is the truth, that's not perjurous, right?
Is that impeachment?
It can be impeachment. That's what the defense would say. If an individual is on the stand and says, hey, this is what I actually saw, and an attorney will say, well, what about this article where you said you saw something different? And it's going to depend on whether that information that he's testifying to on the stand benefits the defense or does it benefit the prosecution. These are the issues that you work out in court.
Gotcha. All right, I think we're good.